Bob Fitzsimmons, better known as Ruby Robert, or Speckled Chest, was born May 26, 1863, in Helston, Cornwall, England. Now, some sources state New Zealand, but for the sake of this conversation, we're going to stick with Cornwall, England. He died October 22nd, 1917 in Chicago, Illinois. He would suffer from pneumonia. Now, former heavyweight champion James J. Jeffries was said to have cured his pneumonia with 5 gallons of brandy. Now, that's what's been stated. But unfortunately for Bob Fitzsimmons, he would pass away from that disease. He stood 5'11" and a half inches, and he weighed 150 to 175 pounds. I'm Scrapbook Boxing. And I would like to go over the career with Bob Fitzsimmons with you. During the course of that conversation, I would like to talk about February 14th, 1896. It was a fight he had with Peter Maher. George Gardner, when he would capture the light heavyweight championship belt. He would take the middleweight strap from non-Perel Jack Dempsey. And one of the most surprising heavyweight matches took place between Gentleman Jim Corbett and Bob Fitzsimmons. That fight would take place in Carson City, Nevada. Famous solar plexus punch. Let's talk about those fights right here with you on the Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuffs series. Now, on the evening of 1954, Bob Fitzsimmons was elected into the Boxing Hall of Fame and the International Boxing Hall of Fame in 1990, rightfully so. He had a sparring partner by the name of Bob Armstrong, who also sparred many times with Gentleman Jim Corbett, as well as James J. Jeffries. And Bob Armstrong would become the colored heavyweight champion of the world. And he would state that Bob Fitzsimmons' power punches was like a mule kick. You see, he worked with Bob Fitzsimmons as a blacksmith. And a blacksmith job is to hold a heavy mallet, pounding metal, mixing it with heat to create a form or shape that would produce a product. And he would work at the cattle farm and create horseshoes. Now, although Bob Fitzsimmons had thin legs, he had wide shoulders. He was very powerful. So 5'11", he weighed 150 to 175 pounds. And he had well over 100 exhibition fights. He himself would stake claim to 350 bouts. But during the course of his exhibitions, he'd be in there with Joe Chowensky, an outstanding Jewish heavyweight boxer, who would eventually teach Jack Johnson phenomenal moves and offensive skills. He had exhibitions with Billy Woods and Jimmy Carroll. Very good boxer was Jimmy Carroll. John Van Heest, Peter Maher, and Fred Woods, just to name a few. He'd have a no decision contest with the Black Pearl, Harris Martin. He'd be in the ring with Patty Frank Slavin. And Slavin would fight Bob Fitzsimmons, as well as Jim Smith. Jim Smith would face Jake Kilrain in 1887 to stake claim as heavyweight champion. Slavin would also be in the ring with Charlie Mitchell and Frank Craig, the Harlem Coffee Cooler. He would face Bob Armstrong as well as Joe Butler. Bob Fitzsimmons would also face Nonpareil Jack Dempsey. Jack Dempsey was a slickster. It was interesting with the Jack Dempsey and George LeBlancy fight. That later years, 1926-27, you would have a Jack Dempsey fighting a fighting Marine. Because that was George LeBlancy's nickname, as it was Gene Tunney's nickname. But that fight would become famous because of the pelvic punch. Jack Dempsey would also face Bob Fitzsimmons, and that's where he would lose his middleweight championship strap. So now Bob Fitzsimmons was middleweight champion. He would take on George Gardner, the current light heavyweight champion. George Gardner would defeat Jack Root for that title. That would be the first light heavyweight championship contest in boxing history. George Gardner and Jack Root. So Bob Fitzsimmons would take the title away from George Gardner. Be a 12-round knockout, March 2nd, New Orleans. March 28th, he had an exhibition with George Gardner. Now a two-time champion, he would move up once again and face Gentleman Jim Corbett in Carson City, Nevada. And you had both men come out with long robes. Matt Masterson would be the timekeeper. And that fight would be filmed. And if you're fortunate enough to catch the film of that fight, it was broken up like potato chip fragments, had to be put together again. You had 11 rounds of that action. And you can catch Bob Fitzsimmons striking Gentleman Jim Corbett with his famous solar plexus punch. In a moment of impact, when Gentleman Jim Corbett was hit with that punch, he collapsed like a sack of potatoes. Because he had never been hit to the body like that before. And Bob Fitzsimmons, as I stated earlier, was a blacksmith. Hour after hour, he would develop his forearms. And Bob Armstrong would state that his forearms were like a baseball bat, made of hickory wood. And hickory wood is the hardest wood. That's what the old baseball bats were made of. And that's how strong and powerful his forearms were. And he would nail Gentleman Jim Corbett with that body punch. It could be heard within the first 3 rows from the spectators. Now as for Peter Maher, he was born March 16th, 1869 in Callaway, Ireland. He died July 22nd, 1940, Baltimore, Maryland. He stood 5'11" and 3/4 inches and weighed 172 to 195 pounds. He fought fighters such as Peter Jackson, Black Prince. And Peter Jackson would be in the ring with George Godfrey, who would become the colored heavyweight champion of the world. By the way, Peter Jackson faced Gentleman Jim Corbett in a 61-round draw. He was promised never a shot at the heavyweight championship crown from John O'Sullivan. Or Peter Jackson was a phenomenal fighter. But he also be in the ring with Jack Aston and Joe Butler. Joe Chorinsky, as a matter of fact, he fought Joe Chorinsky several times. They had exhibitions in a famous play called Uncle Tom's Cabin. It was supposed to be an exhibition in that play, but several times these men would get it on, live on stage. Mayhaw would also be in the ring with Frank Craig, the Harlem Coffee Cooler. And the Harlem Coffee Cooler would be in the ring with Joe Butler and C.A.C. Smith and Peter Mayhaw, Ted Pritchard and Tommy Ryan. Mayhaw would also be in the ring with Bob Fitzsimmons. But he would also fight Frank Patty Slavin. Slavin was in the ring with Bob Fitzsimmons and Peter Jackson, as well as Jim Smith. Jim Smith would face Jake Kilrain in 1887 for the Police Gazette strap. He would also face Peter Mayhaw for the heavyweight championship strap of England, did Jim Smith. But Mayhaw would also be in the ring with Joe McAuliffe, Charlie Mitchell, and Bob Armstrong, as well as Joe Butler and Jim Hall. Mayhaw would also be in the ring with Joe Butler himself. He would face Johnny Banks, C.A.C. Smith, and Jim Daly, Frank Craig, the Harlem Coffee Cooler, as well as George Godfrey and Bobby Dobbs. He would also face C.A.C. Smith. And he would face fighters such as Frank Craig, Harlem Coffee Cooler, Black Diamond, Harry Woodson, Fred Morris, and Bob Armstrong. Mayhaw would also face George Godfrey, who became colored heavyweight champion. And he fought fighters such as Charlie Hadley and Peter Mayhaw, as well as Jake Kilrain. He was scheduled to have a fight with John O'Sullivan, but that fight was called off once Sullivan found out who exactly he was fighting. Godfrey would be in the ring with Jim Smith, Jack Johnson, and Mike Donovan. Mike Donovan was the former middleweight champion of the world. Let's take a look at this famous fight that took place February 14th, 1896. It was $1,000 upfront money and $10,000 bet. It was a winner-take-all, and he would fight for the Police Gazette belt. Bob Fitzsimmons would earn in defeating Gentleman Jim Corbett in Carson City. Let's take a look at the Police Gazette scrapbook. Now we're looking at famous battles fought at the Olympic Club Arena, New Orleans, Louisiana. March 2nd, 1892, Bob Fitzsimmons defeats Peter Mayhaw, 12 rounds. Irishman bruised and bleeding, unable to continue. Other Fistic Classics reviewed for Police Gazette viewers or readers. Let's take a look at the reading of this. I'm just going to scan this for you. It isn't very often that a middleweight boxer is capable of taking on a clever heavyweight with rattling good record and beating him. However, such an encounter took place 30 years ago. This month, with Bob Fitzsimmons was a victor and Peter Mayhaw defeated. In 1891, Mayhaw came to America carrying the laurels of Ireland. In 3 months' time, he fought Bubbles Davis, Jim Daly, Jack Fallon, Jack Smith, Sailor Brown, and Joe Godfrey. Now I'm just skidding here. As you can see here, the Irishman weighed 178 pounds. He was 13 pounds more than Bob Fitzsimmons and was no amateur or weakling in the ring. The match was held March 2nd, 1892 at the Olympic Club in New Orleans. Now, I did a video on the Carnival of Champions. The Carnival of Champions was held that same year, September the 5th, 6th, and 7th. So they were pretty busy during that year at the Olympic Club in New Orleans. And it goes on to tell you the opening round and what took place in the actual match. I'm going to go through that with you at another time. Just want to give you some articles. This is the Police Gazette Scrapbook. This is one of 850 of these, 1,000 pages each. Peter Manhart easily for Bob Fitzsimmons. Recounting 2 brief battles between Irish and Cornish boxers within 8 days. Former knocked out in less than a round in the first bout. Second stopped after 3 rounds. So you see here, Bob Fitzsimmons was able to handle Peter Manhart with no problem in their other 2 fights. Now, a little more than a year before, Bob Fitzsimmons knocked out James J. Corbett and took the heavyweight championship away from him. He had 2 fights with Peter Manhart, considered one of the best heavyweight contenders. His Fitzsimmons Manhart scraps took place on February 21st and February 29th of 1896. And it basically goes on to talk about the fight. And it's probably about 20 pages of this fight between these 2 men. I just wanted to briefly share that with you. Just give you a view of the book itself. And I gotta tell you, Bob Fitzsimmons was some fighter. He took the title away from James Corbett. And he would proudly represent his belt. Now, I know he never fought a black fighter in defense of his title. But see, Bob was something else. He lost his title to James Jeffries. In fact, he was knocked out. Fought him twice. And the thing about him, he didn't stay around too long. In fact, he never defended his light heavyweight championship belt. But he was some fighter. Some puncher he was. The thing with these old school fighters, they came around at a time when nothing was handed to them. They themselves had to work for what they had. But according to who you were, things were a little easier than it was for the next person. Unfortunately, Peter Jackson and many others didn't get that opportunity as easily as they got it. C.A.C. Smith and others. But these were some great fighters. And I'm glad to have been able to share this message and information with you. You heard about it right here on the Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuffs series. Bob Fitzsimmons, Ruby Rob. Fascinating fighter he was. Thanks for hanging in there with me. Salute to my subscribers. Salute to Bob Fitzsimmons. Salute to the bare knuckle artists. Until next time, peace.